Today's reading is taken from 1 Samuel chapter 4 verses 1 to 22. 1 Samuel chapter 4 verses 1 to 22, and this can be found in your blue Bible on page 228. And the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Now Israel went out to battle against the Philistines. They encamped at Ebenezer, and the Philistines encamped at Aphek. The Philistines drew up in line against Israel, and when the battle spread, Israel was defeated before the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men on the field of battle. And when the people came to the camp, the elders of Israel said, "Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord here from Shiloh, that it may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies." So the people sent to Shiloh and brought from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. As soon as the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel gave a mighty shout, so that the earth resounded. And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shouting, they said, "What does this great shouting in the camp of the Hebrews mean?" And when they learned that the ark of the Lord had come to the camp, the Philistines were afraid, for they said, "A god has come into the camp." And they said, "Woe to us, for nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us, who can deliver us from the power of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with every sort of plague in the wilderness. Take courage and be men, O Philistines, lest you become slaves to the Hebrews, as they have been to you. Be men and fight." So the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and they fled, every man to his home, and there was a very great slaughter, for 30,000 foot soldiers of Israel fell. And the ark of God was captured, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. A man of Benjamin ran from the battle line and came to Shiloh the same day, with his clothes torn and with dirt on his head. When he arrived, Eli was sitting on his seat by the road, watching, for his heart trembled for the ark of God. And when the man came into the city and told the news, all the city cried out. When Eli heard the sound of the outcry, he said, "What is this uproar?" Then the man hurried and came and told Eli. Now Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were set so that he could not see. And the man said to Eli, "I am he who has come from the battle. I fled from the battle today." And he said, "How did it go, my son?" He who brought the news answered and said, "Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has also been a great defeat among the people. Your two sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured." As soon as he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell over backward from his seat by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died. For the man was very old and heavy. He had judged Israel 40 years. Now his daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant, about to give birth. And when she heard the news that the ark of God was captured, and that the father-in-law and her husband were dead, she bowed and gave birth, for her pains came upon her. And about this time of her death, the women attending her said to her, "Do not be afraid, for you have borne a son." But she did not answer or pay attention. And she named the child Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God had been captured, and because of her father-in-law and her husband." And she said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured."
Thanks, Kit. We're going to continue in 1 Samuel, which is the series we've called Below the Waterline. And the idea from that comes from when we look at boats, actually. If you remember the first week, we talked about what keeps boats afloat. And the answer has everything to do with what's going on under the surface, what's going on below the waterline. So as we go through this book, we're going to continually get more and more chances to reflect on what God's people really think of him under the surface, what they think of him in their hearts, and how we see God under the surface as well. This is an amazing chance to do this together today from 1 Samuel chapter 4. I wonder how you went as that reading was read today. It's pretty heavy, really, isn't it? Really heavy. Because if you've been journeying in this book with us since the beginning, you know it's been prophesied twice now that Eli and his household's line will be stopped because of their sin against God and toward his people. And today's chapter sits heavy because we see it. We see it unfold today. A really good summary of the whole chapter, I think, is what can be found in the last verse of chapter 4. The glory has departed from Israel, and the ark of God has been captured. Today is a lot about God's glory in these passages. That word glory in the Hebrew language is the word kabod. And the word means three things altogether. So it means glory, it also means honor, and it means weight. It's really interesting, that word weight. The word means that the glory of God are all these three things. So God's glory, his honor, and his weight, meaning his substance, his weightiness. His glory is the seriousness of which we must give him, his weight. So if we make anything more important than God, we are spending time on something not glorious, not honorable, and we're putting more weight away from God and towards that thing. And what's happened in this chapter is the glory of God has departed. This is in the form of the Ark of the Covenant being captured, but it also means God's glory, his honor, his weight, his weightiness is taken away from Israel. It's taken out. And understanding this is going to be really important for us when we get to Eli in this chapter. So keep that in the back of your mind about God's weightiness. This chapter has two main sections. So the first section is about the battle that occurs and the report of the death of Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas. The second part of our reading today is about the news of the battle, and interesting also reports two more deaths, Eli and the wife of Phinehas. As we go through this chapter, there are 3 points for us to follow along, and I've framed these as questions. So here are the 3 questions. So firstly, what went wrong? What went wrong in the heart of Israel? That's the first point, verses 1 to 11. Secondly, what went wrong in Eli's heart? Verses 12 to 18. And then third, how do we get the glory of God back? From verses 19 to 22. So there are the 3 questions. What went wrong in the heart of Israel? What went wrong in Eli's heart? And how do we get the glory of God back? So we're going to look at that first question. What went wrong in the heart of Israel? And let's look at the first 2 verses. They give us a little bit of a glimpse into that. So starting at verse 1, the word of Samuel came to all Israel. By the way, that line is the way of the author signaling that Samuel, the prophet, is going to step out of the picture for a while. In fact, we won't hear from Samuel again until chapter 7. So there's a shift in what the author wants us to know. So we'll keep going in verse 1. Now, Israel went out to battle against the Philistines. I hope you don't mind if I say Philistines. Kit said it. There's 2 ways to say it, Philistines or Philistines. Interestingly, the British way is Philistines and the American way is Philistines. So as an Aussie, I probably should say it the other way, but Philistines seems right in my ears. They went out to battle against the Philistines. They encamped at Ebenezer, and the Philistines encamped at Aphek. The Philistines drew up in line against Israel, and when the battle spread, Israel was defeated before the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men on the field of battle. It's not pleasant. It's not a pleasant opening. We're introduced to an old enemy, actually, the Philistines. The Philistines show up in the Bible as early as Genesis. But the Philistines were a nation descended from the Egyptians. And at this point of 1 Samuel, they settled on the coastal strip of Palestine. And in doing so, they became the main threat to Israel. A little bit about the Philistines that is helpful for us to know. They were known to be fearless. They were known to be amazing warriors. And they were known for their military technology. So they were one of the only armies who had effectively created iron chariots and iron weapons. And so some of their strategy is shown in verse 2, actually. It says the Philistines drew up in line against Israel. That was a new thing. That language means that the Philistines were the only ones to think strategically when it came to battle. Everyone else kind of just went, go. And these guys had a plan. And it works out well for them because their military plan, kills about 4,000 of God's people. Now, verse 3 is where we begin to see what's lying underneath. The elders ask a question in verse 3. Why has the Lord defeated us? Why has the Lord defeated us? I know, says one of them. We'll just bring God to the battle. We're going to bring the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord here from Shiloh so that it will come among us and save us from the power of our enemies. I wonder if you see what's going on under the surface. When you start to go below the surface, what's the issue? The issue is God's people have gone into this battle without God. They've gone into it lightly and without God. And they lose. So the elders of Israel brainstorm about, where did we go wrong? And they land on the fact of, I know what we should have done. We should have invited God to come with us. So their solution is, hey, let's bring the Ark of the Covenant onto the battlefield. If you're interested, a few things on the Ark of the Covenant. It was this large case made of acacia wood, and it had carved cherubim on the top. And inside of the Ark of the Covenant, there were stone tablets, the same stone tablets of the law that were given to Moses at Mount Sinai. It also had a sample of manna in it, which surely couldn't be good hundreds of years later, but there was manna in it. And that was there as a reminder of God's provision in the past. The Ark of the Covenant was a physical symbol of God's presence. So the elders are thinking, physical symbol of God's presence? Let's take that symbol to the battlefield. And it was a visible reminder of the covenant obligations between God and his people. And for the elders of Israel, maybe they thought back to whenever the Ark of the Covenant had been brought out to battle in the past. Maybe that's what the elders thought. Maybe Numbers 10:35 came to mind when the Ark of the Covenant went before God's people for 3 days and Moses would pray and then God would scatter his enemies. Or maybe the elders remembered how important the Ark of the Covenant was at the Jordan River back in Joshua, and that it was present when Jericho was defeated. Oh, the Ark of the Covenant was there, so maybe that's the key. Perhaps they felt that they needed to try old things to get their same results of the past. And by the way, where the battle is happening is near Aphek. So they take the Ark of the Covenant from Shiloh to Aphek. That's 30 to 35 kilometers in hopes that God would follow them. And by the way, if something happens to the Ark now, they would know this. They'd been thinking this in their minds. If something happens to the Ark, then God seems like he's the loser. Now, God forbid that he would let that happen. So we're going to try and set God up so that he does follow our plans. God will have to save us now. You can see so clearly that the elders want the Ark of the Covenant on the battlefield for manipulation. To try and manipulate Yahweh. To try and use him as a mystic symbol of power for their successors. So they do it, verse 4. They send the Ark of the Covenant from Shiloh with Eli's worthless and wicked sons, Hophni and Phinehas. And bringing the Ark of the Covenant onto the battlefield does have an effect in verse 5. It says that as soon as it came into the camp, all Israel started shouting so that the earth resounded. So, it did have this ploy of getting people up and about. But behind the surface, what's going on below the waterline is God's people are clearly trying to use God, trying to twist his arm, trying to force him to act in their favor. Putting it plainly, God's people are not taking God or his glory seriously. What's below the waterline is that they're using God like a prop, and now they've put God in the game, and they think they're going to win. They aren't seeking God out. They didn't once ask God what he thought. They aren't relying or trusting in him. They are trying to control him. Have you ever tried to use God? On surface value, we'd want to say no, wouldn't we? But what's below the waterline in your heart when I ask that question? I've known Christians who have served. They've given their time and their service to the Lord, but not because their time and service belongs to the Lord in the first place. They do it in hopes that God will bless them. I heard once of someone giving the last of their money to the Lord. They couldn't really afford it, but they thought, I'm going to put it in the offering bowl because they truly believed that God would bless them financially if they gave what they had last into the bowl. Can you see that's trying to use God? That's not seeking God for who he is. That's trying to control God, and it's trying to force and twist his arm to give us what we desire. God doesn't want to be used. God's people are trying to use him, and the irony is that the Philistines don't want to use God. In fact, they take God very seriously. They take God more seriously than his people do. The Philistines in the story, they hear the shout when the Ark of the Covenant comes into the camp, and they ask, what's going on? When they learn that Israel have brought the Ark, they're afraid. They even mention that a God has come into their camp, and they know this God. They know of Yahweh. They've heard about what God did to the Egyptians. They heard about the plagues. They even mentioned the plagues. And they become afraid. God's enemies have a better theology of God than his own people. And they know in verse 9 that they're going to have to fight better than before. They have to fight harder than before. They remember what God can do. They remember God's glory. They remember God's weightiness. And so in verses 1 and 2, God's people went into battle without him and lost. But here in verses 10 and 11, they go into battle with the Ark of the Covenant, and they still lose. But this time they lose big time. In the first battle, they lost 4,000 men, but now it's 30,000 more. And the elders of Israel tried to use God by bringing the ark as a prop. But God's plans, ironically, his plans were for this battle to be used for something that he had already planned out. For Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, to die in the same day. Back in chapter 2, that was prophesied, that they would die on the same day. Well, here it is. God using his plans. Hophni and Phinehas, who go along with this plan to use God, lose their lives. Sometimes I think we think of God like a servant in our house. Below the waterline, we might go through life and we go along with our friends and family. We enjoy what comes along the ride. And we ignore God as if we don't really need him until we do need him. And that's the reason why I think we think of God as a servant sometimes, because a servant doesn't hang out with friends and family, do they? A servant sits in the corner, they do the chores, and then when we feel like we need something, we would ask the servant. We would call God over. That's what God's people are doing. That's what they're doing here. They've called God over when they needed him for help. Hey, God, sorry we forgot you. Could you come and do this for us? They haven't taken God seriously. They haven't sought out the God of glory, the God of honor, the God who is weighty. But just like we see here, God sees our hearts. and he will not allow us to just call on him when we need him. Because if that's the kind of God that you think we serve, you're going to be disappointed with the outcome you get. And that's where God's people find themselves, disappointed with the outcome. The fundamental belief that appears below the waterline here is that God's people believe that God was there to serve them. That God was made in our image, rather than us being made in God's image, rather than us seeing who God is, rather than we, his people, in his image. In our lives, the glory of God has to be the center, not an addition. We need to recognize the weight of God's glory. So that's what went wrong in the heart of Israel. Below the waterline, God was being used for their own purposes, and it was a costly mistake. It was a 34,000 people death mistake. So let's look at what went wrong in Eli's heart then. Let's have a look at verses 12 to 18. Have a look at verse 12. It says, "A man of Benjamin ran from the battle line and came to Shiloh the same day with his clothes torn and with dirt on his head." By the way, the reason the man's clothes are torn and dirt is on his head is not because of the war. That's instantly what I thought. But it's not because of the fighting. It's actually because it was customary that when you mourned, you would tear your clothes and you would put dirt on your head. That's why the messenger looks this way. He's bringing bad news and he's mourning as he brings it. Not that it matters to Eli, of course, because he's already blind. But anyway, it continues, verse 13. "When he arrived, Eli was sitting on his seat by the road watching, for his heart trembled for the ark of God. And when the man came into the city and told the news, all the city cried out. When Eli heard the sound of the outcry, he said, 'What is this uproar?' And the man hurried and came and told Eli. Now Eli was 98 years old. His eyes were set so that he could not see. And the man said to Eli, 'I am he who has come from the battle. I fled from the battle today.' And he said, 'How did it go, my son?' He who brought the news answered and said, 'Israel fled before the Philistines, and there has also been a great defeat amongst the people. Your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured.' And as soon as he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell over backwards from his seat by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died. For the man was old and heavy, and he judged Israel 40 years. Some of the most important lessons in Hebrew literature are found in the small details. There are so many small details that the author doesn't need to tell us here, but he does. And we have to ask why. So note, Eli was sitting on the seat by the road. Why? Why was Eli sitting on the road? And, well, there's actually several reasons, and the text tells us. The first, he's old. So verse 15 mentioned he's 98 years old now. Also, he's blind. So, a 98-year-old man who is standing by the road is probably not a good idea. It is much safer for him to be seated in a chair rather than standing by the road. He's seated because he's an old man, and he's seated. That he is seated is also a clue that the author gives of a sign for Eli to not be able to lead anymore. It's the author's way of saying he is not capable of leading anymore. We're also meant to notice the shocking fact that Eli seems to just overlook that his sons died. Did you notice that? It says, your sons have died and the Ark of the Covenant has been stolen. He doesn't blink twice about his sons dying, but when he mentions that the Ark of the Covenant was stolen, that's when he dies. Eli has had prophesied to him that his sons would die on the same day. Now it's come true, and it doesn't seem to affect him at all. But we are meant to notice what does affect him. As soon as he hears the Ark of God has been captured, he falls over backwards in his seat and dies. These little details are things we're supposed to notice. And it's another sign that the glory of God has departed. So what went wrong? What went wrong in Eli's heart? It was that the glory of the Lord departed from him as well. In one sense, it actually departed. It wasn't actually departed from Eli, it was stolen. So I want us to think about this. The fact that Israel is defeated in battle is the judgment prophesied by God to Eli. What's been going on below the waterline in the heart of Eli and his sons is that they've been abusing the whole system. If you remember in chapters 2 and 3, they've taken food from people with extra large barbecue forks. They've been taking the fat that was meant for God and eating it for themselves. Eli's sons set up a whole brothel in chapter 2 in the tabernacle, in the place where God dwells. And Eli didn't stop any of that. And God warned Eli back in chapter 2, verse 30, that those who have despised God will be cut off. And Eli still didn't do anything. And what we've seen is that not only have Eli and his sons not honored God, they've stolen God's glory. And so God has finally given his judgment on Eli and his sons and his family. Because the last thing we need to notice in terms of details is what is mentioned in verse 18. Can you just have another look at verse 18? It says, as soon as he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell over backwards from his seat by the side of the road, the side of the gate, and his neck was broken and he died. For the man was old and heavy. Isn't that an interesting side note? Why do we need to know that Eli was heavy? That word in Hebrew is the same word that's used for glory. Meaning, Eli was weighty. You see that? Can you see what the author is trying to tell us? God's glory was taken from God and put around Eli's waist. He died weighty. He died heavy. It's a detail that we would never have thought we would need, right? But the author wants to tell us that Eli has stolen God's glory and put it on himself. Remember, weight and glory have the same root, and when people offered an animal sacrifice, the fat that should have been burnt off was supposed to be given to the Lord, and the priest, of course, would get a portion of that, but Eli's sons wanted all of it. Everything they could get, so they would steal the meat before the fat had been burned off. And the author is reminding us that Eli's family literally took the fat. They took the weight. They took the glory that belonged to God and put it on their waist. That's what's going on below the waterline. Why does Eli die? In part, it's because he hears about the ark of God being taken captive, but he also dies because he's heavy. Because he took the weight of God's glory and quite literally put it on himself. So how do we get the glory of God back then? Let's have a look at verses 19 to 22. It says this. Now his daughter-in-law, that's Eli's daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant, about to give birth. So notice this is Phinehas' wife, the son of Eli, the one who just died. We're talking about Phinehas' wife here. And when she heard the news that the ark of God was captured and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she bowed and gave birth, for her pains come upon her. And about the time of her death, the women attending her said to her, "Don't be afraid, you have borne a son." But she didn't answer. She didn't pay attention. And she named the child Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel," because the ark of God had been captured and because of her father-in-law and her husband. And she said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." So here's Phinehas' wife about to give birth. And it does seem confusing the way that the text has written about the order of things. So just to clarify, Phinehas' wife does die in childbirth, but before she dies, she's the one who names her child. And she names her child Ichabod. And you know what that means? Where's the glory? This chapter is all about the glory of God. Where is the glory? And literally every time someone calls the child Ichabod, they're asking, where is the glory? And the question is being asked, where is the glory? Well, the glory has departed. Now for Israel, they're going to sit for a little while with this question, and it challenges their hearts. Where is the glory? What now? How do we get the glory of God back? And we're going to have that answered in part next week in the upcoming chapters of 1 Samuel. But for us, Can we just quickly summarize what we've seen before we answer that question? God's people are guilty of calling God when they need help. They haven't taken God or his glory seriously. We can do the same, can't we? We can be guilty of calling of God when we need him like a servant, rather than letting the glory of God be at the center of our lives. And then we saw Eli, the priest, stealing the glory of God, literally putting the glory of God on his waist. Below the waterline, there's been an abuse of the whole system. Taking from people, taking from God, and literally taking the glory of God on himself. For us, whenever we take God's glory and wear it ourselves, we're committing the same sin. So how do we get the glory of God back? And the answer is not do better. Well, you know what you should do, so just go do better. Boy, I wish I stopped saying that to my kids. The answer is not try harder. That's our default all the time though, isn't it? But interestingly, that's also God's people, Israel. That's their default. That's exactly what they try. Well, we'll just do better. We'll bring God along this time. They forget God and they try to do better, then they try harder, and they bring the Ark of the Covenant 30 to 35 kilometers away from its home into a battlefield, and they still lose because they've just tried harder. How do we get the glory of God back? We'll never be able to do it in our own strength. Rather, we need to let go of trying to hold on to things and ask for God to enable us to seek his glory. In Romans 12, verse 1, Paul says that we are to present our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is our spiritual worship. Notice the sacrifice that belongs to God is our whole lives. It's all of us. And how do we rob God of his glory? We don't give him our whole lives. We take credit for what God has done. Have you ever caught yourself doing that? We serve him, but it's kind of for us. To be noticed, to be seen, to feel something, to feel good, to feel worth something. So at the end of the day, we can say, at least I've served the Lord today. I think our text today is suggesting that if we have the wrong motives like Israel, it's not going to work. And in fact, what happens is that we rob God of his glory, and we need to recognize the weight of his glory. And I mentioned Romans 12:1 being a living sacrifice is what we're supposed to be. It's Paul's way of saying, if you really get this, Jesus has changed you from the inside out and you're really going to give God the glory in your life. If you really understand what it means to be a Christian, you'll live like a living sacrifice. But notice, I've mentioned this before, but living sacrifice are two words that actually don't go together. Sacrifices are usually something that's dead, not alive. It's a figure of speech that Paul uses to be a living sacrifice where two contradictory ideas come together. Sacrifice means offering something that is killed, but living is something that's alive and active and constant. And Paul says, to ensure that we don't rob God of his glory, we present ourselves as living sacrifices, as living and alive and active and dead. So what does that mean? It means when we give of ourselves to God in every way, our hearts, our lives, our being, our duty, our service, our situations, we are continually dying to ourselves. The giving of ourselves is never over. Continually we give of ourselves every day, every hour, every moment, killing our wants, our desires, and bringing that to Jesus' feet as a sacrifice. We put ourselves to death, the idea that we can live the way we want, that we know best, so that the glory of God doesn't come to us, but to him. And to the extent that we understand this and ask Jesus to enable us to be living sacrifices, then we will be able to put the glory of God in its rightful place in our lives. Then and only then. So if you're here today and you would call yourself a Christian, can I ask, honestly, if you look at your heart, How have you robbed God of his glory? Honestly. If you really paused and reflected at how you are living and what you're doing, what would your life point to? Is it the glory of God or the glory of you? And to follow on to that, what do you need to ask for God to do so that your life would be a living sacrifice? What heart attitude do you need to ask him to change and transform? Is it the way you view money? Is it what you devote your time to? Is it the way that you serve the Lord? The wrong motives of serving the Lord? And in that prayer, don't ask God, oh, I wish I was better. Please make me better. It didn't go so well in today's chapter. Ask God, forgive me, cleanse me, change me. Put the thing to death in my life that is more important to me than you, and enable me to give God the glory and to live holy for Jesus. And this morning, if you wouldn't call yourself a Christian, or perhaps you're new here to church and Jesus and all that comes along with that, and you might not be sure at all what you believe, what I want to say to you is, it's an interesting thing about our culture, because our culture tells you that glory is the most important thing in the world. But I think that we both know that if you chase that, we will come up empty. Maybe you've chased that in the past, maybe you're chasing it now. But when Jesus came into the world, he came not seeking his own glory. He came seeking the glory of the Father, to the point where he died on a cross and rose again for the glory of his Father. And in doing so, he has shown us a better king than anything that this world could show us. Someone better to follow, a better one to give glory to. So would you follow that king? Would you turn from your sin and trust in King Jesus? Because if you do, you'll be seeking the glory of God in all things. And that will free you. It'll free you from the pressures of the world, and it will enable you to serve King Jesus. So why not make today that day? Turn from sin, trust in Jesus, and he'll give you a heart that will enable you to take the weight of glory off yourself and on Jesus, its rightful place. Let's pray together. Father, we're sorry for when we string you along. We're guilty of asking for your help when we need it. We steal your glory. We take your credit. We don't give you the praise and worship of our whole lives. Would you help us, Father, to be living sacrifices, putting ourselves to death and offering ourselves to you, holy and acceptable. Enable us to give of ourselves to Jesus in every area. Help us to seek the glory of the Father and turn and trust in Jesus again today. We pray this for our sake and your glory. Amen.